Chapter 9, and Monomon said,
The real danger of traveling is that no matter how prepared you think you are, you never have enough first aid material for what you need, and safety is always just a little too far for comfort. Lem makes the executive decision to return to the City of Tears on the spot. Quirrell won't die, but Lem can only do so much with bandages and water, especially with the acid doing gods know what to his carapace. If Quirrell has feelings about his wounds, Lem forgets to notice, which is definitely not a side effect of panicking, because Lem doesn't panic and is, in fact, incredibly, outrageously, genuinely, very calm. Lem is so calm that he doesn't even allow them to stop at the Relic Seeker shop, and instead ushers them directly to the only operational hot spring in the City of Tears that he knows of, high up in the abandoned pleasure house. Everyone, after all, knows that you can't have premium-grade medical care without a deep soak in a hot spring's minerals. Lem can't remember which floor the hot spring is on, and gets off at nearly every one to make sure they don't miss it, cursing under his breath at each wrong floor, making himself even more cranky with each realization that there's hardly anything useful in any of the rooms. Every stop of the elevator lift is all the same debris of some daily life in another age, not a decent bandage or water jug to be found. Even the kitchen is mostly full of mulch and rot. It's on second thought that Lem digs deeper into the kitchen drawers and unearths a very ancient jar of jam and a pickle of something edible probably. Quirrell pokes his head out of the lift. "Get back in there and be on metaphorical bed rest," Lem orders.
"I don't think the hot spring is in the kitchen, Relic Seeker."
"Don't be smart with me. I'm doing you a favor," Lem says, pulling out drawers with a vengeance in search of plates and utensils. "Hot spring or no, nobody ever recovered while hungry." Lem pulls out the utensil drawer, which he realizes 2 moments too late has rotted all the way through, and the entire drawer worth of spoons and soggy wood falls out the bottom and scatters across the floor. "Oh, never mind," Lem snaps. "This stupid city's good for nothing but 1,000 ways to die." He slams the broken drawer back in its shelf and sweeps up the jam and pickles and marches back to the lift. "Come on, Quirrell! I won't have you out of that hot spring for 1 second longer!" Quirrell, instead, picks up a spoon, which is at first something Lem figures was rather smart of him, considering that Lem isn't keen to eat jam with his fingers. Then Quirrell looks at it oddly, like he's never seen one before. Gives a funny little hiccup. Spoon still clutched in one hand, eyes crinkled as if in a laugh, Quirrell covers his face and turns away. "Nailsmith," she says, "I have a request of you." The nailsmith's hut is an exercise in solitude. Any bug may approach, in theory, but none are welcome by virtue of the nailsmith's utter lack of either hospitality or inhospitality. While the nailsmith bears no ill will towards any bug, nor any apparent opinion whatsoever, it is difficult to loiter in a house while the nailsmith continues to toil, single-minded, his entire body bent and twisted to his task, like a living, breathing extension of his forge. The teacher finds it much like her archives, a location single-mindedly devoted to its task, steeped deep in its practice, irrevocably suited to the sole inhabitant's tastes. She will never find the nailsmith's hut pleasant, but she can recognize a fellow when she meets one. Because he has been required by the Pale King's missive, the nailsmith hears her out with unsympathetic patience, something more akin to a dutiful silence, so that he can return better equipped with instructions and directions to the craft for which he lives. When she finishes, he mulls over her request with the same dispassion, evaluating not for their worth, but for his own ability to complete them. She is, truthfully, unsure what would happen if the nailsmith sent her away now. She may have a permit from the Pale King and a block of pale ore granted for her use, but looking at the nailsmith now, she wonders if the Pale King himself could make the nailsmith forge a nail he didn't want to.
"It can be done," says the nailsmith at last. "Artistry is not my forte, but it can be done."
"I have seen your work. The filigree is nothing unusual."
"Filigree is one thing,"
says the nailsmith. He draws a beautiful nail of pale ore alloy from behind his forge, where it had been sitting in its scabbard against the wall, like An unused umbrella. The going rate for such a piece must be hundreds of thousands of geo. He gives it to her one-handed, without so much as a second glance.
The designs are merely lines, closely woven together and extremely delicate lines, of course, but nonetheless straight lines. To replace lines with written language is another beast.
The teacher examines the blade herself. Her tendrils are weak compared to the weight of a whole broadsword, but she forces herself to lift it to the light. After a moment, she says, "Despite your claims, there's weaver silk spun with less finery than this. The delicacy of these lines are so thin, finely carved, that they might as well be invisible from a distance."
Did I mishear you? Such degree of fine carving was what you wanted.
Would text inscription be possible if the lines were larger, more spread out?
That depends on how much text you'd like written on the blade.
As much as possible. The nailsmith hums. He has a lovely baritone.
People are saying that to me more and more nowadays. Do whatever is possible. But I am always unsure what is or isn't possible until it is demanded of me, and I am forced to make it happen. And then it is suddenly very possible. Perhaps I should say, I could do it if we used a different metal than pale ore.
No, says the teacher.
And now, I am knowing something of what I must do.
I have good reasons, says the teacher. I ask not the impossible for fun or sport. This sword must not break, nor dull, nor falter. I must keep its wielder alive, no matter the cost.
That is not always a wise ideal, says the nailsmith. Perhaps this nail wielder, pardon my directness, but it's not you, is it? You look like you could hardly lift a dagger.
When she shakes her head, he says,
Making the nail tool lend?
It is not my nail at all. It will belong to a... She hesitates. Although she knows of the power of words, its power is felt most strongly when those words serve to name a fellow bug. Her student, her colleague, her co-conspirator, her only true friend, hers. Someone I know, says the teacher.
A knight?
Says the nailsmith. The teacher shakes her head.
A guard? A servant? Ugh, keep your secrets then. In the practice of service, at the very least, I presume, nobody else would dare pick up a blade for any reason but to serve in this kingdom. At any rate, perhaps in the course of his service, this unbreakable nail should do its job too well, and the nail wielder outlive his lord.
And if the owner of this nail is to have no lord whatsoever?
Then perhaps the wielder of this nail outlive the Pale King himself, says the nailsmith, which would be just the same.
The teacher lowers her head. Oh, she's still holding the prototype nail, she realizes, as if she were the knight, waiting on her lord. She puts the nail down and stretches her strained tendrils. She mulls over her thoughts, a series of rare and private ones, which she's never said aloud, not even to her most trusted and favorite student. But if there's anyone who'd take these words to his grave out of sheer ambivalence, it would be the nailsmith. And if she cannot say these words to her closest friend, then perhaps she should settle for a stranger. It is not my place to decide for him, she says at last. Or at least, it will not be my place to decide for him much longer. But if I am permitted to hope, I would rather he live for nothing than die for something. The nailsmith's beard twitches, but she can't read his expression.
You are far crueler than the rumors say.
Perhaps it is so cruel of me to desire someone I love to live. But I came to request a nail, says the teacher. I did not come to request forgiveness.
And at this rate, you won't even manage to request the nail,
says the nailsmith briskly.
Only now you're telling me things I need to know. If you tell me about bits and bobbles of how the nail should look, I know nothing of what its purpose is, and I cannot make a weapon without knowing what it's for. Tell me what this nail should do for this someone you know. An impossibility will not stand between you and all the words you need inscribed on this blade.
If she had a face to smile with, she would. She settles for a peaceful incline of her mask and folds her tendrils. She nods.
So then, teacher, what will you say? You will get better, and if you die 5 feet from the hot spring, says Lem, I will kill you myself, personally, with my own 2 hands.
Quirrell laughs at him.
I will! Do not slip, or fall, or get lost somehow, or space out, or do anything except put your body in that water, specifically with your head above the waterline. I forbid you from drowning in the hot spring that's supposed to heal you.
I won't.
You can't guarantee it,
says Lem, specifically to mean,
you can't guarantee you won't space out like you have been for the last several weeks.
Just as Quirrell undoes the holster on his belt, carefully lays his nail down on the side of the bath, dips a hand into the water to test the temperature, and otherwise continues his truly impressive streak of not fading out and falling in face first like a drunken aspid that has more or less carried on the entirety of their trip back from the archives.
Lem squints.
Fine, stay there,
says Lem, and goes to set down their packs on the bench nearby, which isn't especially drier than the floor, but it's mostly about the principle of the thing. He snatches a towel off a nearby rack. Can't possibly be clean, but clearly it was of good make to survive this long, and is probably cleaner than anything they dragged in from their mud-covered traveling. He leaves Quirrell's nail where Quirrell put it. He never stops listening to the sound of the water, like he could track Quirrell's movements with them. He's weirdly hyper-aware of Quirrell's every motion, as if some part of Lem is braced for tragedy to strike the moment Quirrell is out of his sight. He certainly has a consistent track record of exactly that. But when Lem turns around, Quirrell is still there, and hasn't even gotten himself killed in the meantime. Miraculous feat, really.
All right then, come here,
Lem says, holding out a hand. Quirrell offers up his right arm without complaint, giving him the biggest and most easily accessible burn. Quirrell's injuries are partially healed, and that's the problem. Lem can already imagine the weakened shell spots, prone to breakage and infection, that such poorly tended wounds would produce. Just looking at Quirrell's wounds in Lem's hand makes him nauseous. Lem dunks the towel in the hot spring and shakes all the dust out.
This is going to be unpleasant.
I can scarcely imagine whatever healing properly requires would be more unpleasant than the initial injury.
Don't be smart.
Lem takes the towel in firm grip and braces on Quirrell's arm. Are you ready?
Isn't that the medical care equivalent of an old wives' tale?
Yeah, and Hollanist's wives spend a good amount of time either as guards, soldiers, or assassins. So I figure they know what they're talking about.
Lem doesn't give him any more warning and starts scrubbing at Quirrell's wound, which has already been softened by the warm water, and gets it bleeding again. Quirrell hardly even flinches, but Lem can see the pain and the tension returning to Quirrell's shoulders.
I must say,
Quirrell says, voice taut,
your experience with tending wounds surprises me.
Lem feels like he should be offended, but in truth, he can't be. He cuts a very specific figure, and that figure isn't a nurturing or tender type.
I wasn't born in Hollownest, you know. I journeyed here, same as...
Lem stops.
Same as you?
He thinks.
Truly?
Again, he thinks of Quirrell in the archive, confidently speaking and even more confidently walking, familiarity in his every step. Even in his dazes, he walked directly to the stacks. Quirrell watches him with a strange hesitance.
Just because it has been a while. Doesn't mean I forgot everything I learned on the way.
Coral laughs.
Did you often have to treat...
Ugh! He hisses as Lem gets at a sore spot on his shoulder.
acid burns on your journey?
No, Lem says, but it's all the same, isn't it?
What, medical care?
Obviously not all medical care, but wounds are practically the same, aren't they? Wash them out, close them up, eat lots of carapaces to help your own.
I do not know enough to argue with you, and yet the memory of every healer I have ever met is screaming that I should.
How many healers have you met?
Is the obvious follow-up question, but Lem can't bring himself to ask it. Something about receiving an answer feels like inviting untruths. More lies by omission, more things for Coral to deflect with jokes. Which is Coral's right, of course, since Coral is only a stranger who lives in Lem's house, and it's not like Coral asked to be there. But still... The silence hangs. Lem methodically scrubs out Coral's injuries. They're nothing life-threatening, even if Lem had let them be, but there are no paper cuts either. A few will definitely scar, and Coral will have to see a professional about his mask. Lem is not a bug who feels the urge to speak when he has nothing to say. And what could he say? What questions would he ask? Coral has been so content to let Lem spin and flail in the dark, only offering hints, oblique references, and metaphors. That was when he was offering anything at all. Who's to say that just because he's unprepared in this moment, that he won't have his walls back up the next? It's not that Lem doesn't understand. It was Lem who declined, and still does, and will again if Coral asks, to elaborate on where he came from before Hollow Nest. Lem likes his privacy and his closed doors, and, like anyone else, has a list of things he'd rather not bring up again. It's because he understands that he...
My, you've become a loud thinker,
says Coral.
I'm peeved because I've come all this way, and instead of having a good soak, I'm here making sure you don't die.
Thank you,
says Coral, quite sincerely for someone who spent an inordinate amount of time explaining not a single thing to Lem.
You really didn't have to.
Thank me when you survive. There's still a chance you and your open wounds will catch an infection and die while I'm not looking.
Coral seems to find that immensely entertaining, gods darn him. They put the bandages on as best as Lem knows how, but then after that, all there is to do is wait and let the hot springs do what they can. The healing properties of hot springs, too, is something of an old wives' tale, but, well, Hollow Nest wives and all that. Coral tries to persuade Lem to get in with him, and frankly, Lem wishes that he could, but the heat of the bath is getting to him, practically boiling Lem in his shell.
Don't move, Lem warns. You've got a lot of repairs to make on your shell. Sit there and get to work, and eat that jam while you're at it.
Coral sighs and sinks slightly lower into the water.
Right away, healer.
Lem grunts and fully intends to walk away. He has a half-formed notion about going back to the kitchen, seeing if the corpses Hollow Nest so helpfully provided for them had salvageable chitin. Every bug with half a mind to think knew that the best way to heal up your shell was to feed it other shells. They'd need a thorough washing, of course, with some alcohol, but if any place in the City of Tears was going to have strong drinks... Lem's foot brushes against Coral's nail. He looks down at it, and in the light, Lem catches a line of text on the blade.
Ch, green, O, path, pilgrim, worship, O, acid, O, empty, they are God respected.
He stops. Lem knew, in an academic sort of sense, that Coral's nail was covered in archive shorthand. It was the whole reason he asked Coral if he knew the way to the archive to begin with. To forget that would be ludicrous. Yet, Lem thinks as he picks it up, there is a world of difference between knowing that Coral's nail is covered in a certain kind of text and being able to decipher that text. Before, Lem had only seen snatches of poorly scribbled notes in Wanderer's journals, or the densely packed, almost impossible to read inscriptions on the nail itself, hardly enough to translate from.
But now, Lem had been in the archive. He'd seen how the characters flowed downwards in almost, but not quite, straight lines before being displayed for easier reading. Seeing that, Lem sees the words streaming down Quirrell's nail in exactly the same way. It's almost frightening how easy it is, as though the words are so desperate to be understood. They're cheating and slipping Lem the answers without any work on his part. His fingers itch for a notebook, a pen, a proper work surface. The nail is so filled with text, Lem can only guess how much information has been crammed onto it. He guesses at least 5 large pages of his small, neat handwriting, and suspects he is underestimating significantly. Lem wishes he was at his desk wearing proper gloves so he could study the text without damaging the nail in the safety of his shop, where Quirrell would be. And the last time Lem tried to take a look at Quirrell's nail, Quirrell made a joke at his expense, and Lem is none too keen to repeat the performance. Lem looks back. Quirrell stares back at him.
No need to look so guilty,
says Quirrell.
You can read it, if you like.
I don't need another joke at my expense, thank you.
No jokes. It's written in archive shorthand, is it not? You've learned a bit of it. Why not give it a shot?
Things unsaid hang thick in the air. Lem can feel them crawling on his shell, all the thoughts Quirrell has been hiding. But, for the first time, it feels as though Quirrell is trying to say them, that he is struggling through the same encasing distance separating Lem and the rest of the world, that suffocating barrier between his fellow bugs Lem has never been able to force his way through. Lem's fingers wrap slowly around the hilt, and he sits himself down on the edge of the spring, letting his legs soak in the water. He takes the nail out of the holster to hold the blade flat in his hand. Quirrell doesn't adjust his position much, still facing away from the water, but he looks up towards Lem as he scans over the engravings.
You'll tell me if I mistranslate something?
Lem asks, without really expecting a response.
I can't,
says Quirrell.
I don't know what it says.
You what?
Not a word of it.
It's your nail! I haven't seen you go 10 feet without the thing. You're choking now, surely.
I only wish, says Quirrell. During my travels outside of Hollownest, I had a few memory problems. I thought my nail was inscribed with incomprehensible garbage for years, and when I remembered how to read it.
After a long moment, Quirrell shrugs.
A lot of things happened all at once.
Well, Lem isn't going to pry. Not his business. He's not a snoop, just a guy who occasionally digs up personal objects from dead folks for fun, and definitely not some weird voyeur to other people's magical sword voodoo nonsense.
I think best when I translate out loud, says Lem.
By all means, then.
Can't make heads or tails of the formatting, Lem says, but here the section it reads. Pilgrims of Green Path pay respects to their god at a lake of empty?
He leans closer to the text.
Why would acid be... Oh, of course, textless. A lake of textless acid. Of course someone using archive shorthand would specify that.
Quirrell shifts in the water, resettling a bit, but Lem doesn't sense any great urgency, so he keeps reading.
Shrine is... humble, perhaps? Humble, but well made. Carved into the shell of a great beast. Interior is filled with green. It's oddly emphasized, most likely referring to a plant life of some kind. As the rest. Beautiful, solemn place, allowed but not welcomed. Perhaps I carried too much Hollownest with me.
Lem hums to himself.
A scout report of some kind, or a travel log?
He glances down at Quirrell, who seems equally puzzled.
Lake cavern wide, depth unknown. Fascinating trip, wish to visit again.
Lem frowns.
There's no separation between that sentence and the next, but it seems unrelated. Maybe it's truly random text, but that would be a monumental effort for so little return.
Keep going, says Quirrell.
You waited this long, you can wait for me to organize my thoughts.
Lem runs a fingertip along the fine engraving.
City of Tears architecture defined by grooves and channels in its buildings and streets, constructed for the endless rainfall from the ceiling. The source is the Blue Lake, fed by numerous underground flows that all collect in the pocket made by geological forces eons past. As a result, dry real estate becomes a premium and is usually higher up due to the nature of rain collection along the cavern floor. The tallest tower to date, the Watcher Spire, is literally unpriceable and never entered the real estate market when it was completed 50 years ago. For the first time in centuries, deeper real estate is no longer more valuable.
Lem taps his fingers along the blade.
50 years ago? Well, that's a timetable, at least. This text was originally written just around the time Hollowness fell. Isn't that helpful? This is hardly a wanderer's journal, a little too much like an academic essay for that. But I do enjoy when authors date their record so clearly, whoever this writer is.
I wrote this, says Quirrell.
Lem stares at him. The only answer that Lem could possibly draw from a response like that is that Quirrell is, in some manner, insane. Hollowness fell decades before Lem was even hatched. There's no way that Quirrell is telling the truth, no matter how sincere he looks. It's simply not possible.
That was my first peer-reviewed article,
says Quirrell, sounding like he's in more disbelief than Lem.
It was about how urban planning out of geographical necessity
Quirrell frowns like he's struggling to remember.
Exacerbated class differences through flood zones and sheltered zones, I think?
Somehow, says Lem, your sheer disbelief makes you almost believable.
Don't believe me. I tell you, this isn't possible.
But I suppose the text about Green Path was you as well?
Quirrell starts scanning his nail on his own, nodding.
Yes, it was supposed to be only field notes, but it later became a model that I'd give the TAs for what good field notes should look like.
And then he stops talking abruptly as a dawning sort of horror begins to emerge, as though Quirrell is seeing something hideous crawling out from the ore.
Lem, stop reading.
Lem pauses.
Why on earth would I do that? It's valuable information from before Hollowness fell.
Trust me, there's nothing valuable in...
Quirrell stops.
Please, just give it back to me.
Huh.
Lem ponders.
Did you say it was your first peer-reviewed essay?
Quirrell does not respond, and that is all the answer Lem needs. Quirrell's eyes widen.
Please don't.
Lem returns to the text with a new ferocity.
Awfully ambitious for your first, wasn't it? Most graduates choose something a little more contained for a thesis, but a romantic like you wanted to write on the whole history of a capital city.
It wasn't the capital, the White Palace.
Wasn't a city, and you and I both know it. Now, we can't let this beginning effort of yours go unread, can we? That would be a waste of a young Quirrell's hard work.
Older current Quirrell looks as though he has swallowed something spiky, poisonous, and alive.
Lem!
To begin, oh, Quirrell, you had a necessary preamble,
Lem says, a wide and sadistic grin growing on his face. Quirrell is actively blushing now, and Lem is reveling in his embarrassment.
I insist!
The foundation was built in an uninhabited cavern long abandoned before the first settlers of Hollowness arrived.
That was an accepted theory. Void Kingdom artifacts weren't properly dated until...
Finding a home in a place scorned by the other tribes of the area. Oh my, what a wonderful use of passive voice.
Oh God, stop Relic Seeker. I beg you. I was a young graduate student, inexperienced.
The eternally raining area was known as Raining Cave.
Lem can't help the snort that escapes him.
Did you really just...
Quirrell makes a wild grab for the nail, but Lem has the advantage of not being injured and also having the higher ground. Lem is nearly cackling.
You did! You repeated yourself twice!
Quirrell looks like he is actively attempting to leave his body and is failing miserably.
I don't see why you're so embarrassed,
Lem says, seeing exactly why Quirrell is so embarrassed.
Just consider your writing is preserved. Generations from now, long after you are dead, relic seekers can be studying this nail.
Lem, please. Quirrell's face is in his hands, actively attempting to hide from everything that he has just been made aware of. Or perhaps he is hiding his face, trying to hang on to whatever shreds of dignity he has left.
Don't be so modest, Quirrell the Scholar,
Lem says, running an appreciative finger over Quirrell's words.
Many a historian would kill for such a permanent...
Scholar?
Lem looks up. Quirrell has emerged from his hands.
What?
Lem says, because he honestly doesn't know what Quirrell is talking about.
What do you mean, scholar?
Well, it's right here.
Lem points to a string of characters near the crossguard.
Credited to, well, there's a pictogram here, but I assume this is the pictogram for your name. Credited to Quirrell the Scholar. I can only assume?
Quirrell frowns.
So she changed the title.
She...
Lem knows instantly he's made a mistake. He said he wasn't going to pry. He swore that he'd let Quirrell have his space and avoid all the questions that Quirrell wants to.
It seems that my life has been longer than we both knew,
says Quirrell at length, which does nothing to assuage the sheer amount of low-key panic Lem is definitely not feeling.
Perhaps someday I'll tell you the full story, if you'd like to hear it. But for now...
Quirrell stares at the water, then sinks lower.
Well, she was the one who taught me everything I knew. She thought that my title at the archive was antiquated. We used to argue over it for fun. You see, faculty were teachers, staff were archivists, so I was head archivist. It was only after I took the role that she always said that I did more traveling than archiving, and that the whole title should be changed.
So when the nail was made, because she changed the title, it was all inscribed as Scholar?
Perhaps. Or maybe she only changed the text on this nail in particular when she commissioned it.
That's preposterous,
says Lem definitively, as if not everything that's come out of Quirrell's mouth in the last 10 minutes hasn't been preposterous.
This nail is made of pale ore. First off, not just anyone can simply commission a nail made of pale ore. And second off, you don't simply make one of these and then give it away.
It came with a duty I couldn't refuse, says Quirrell flatly. There it is. Lem's overstepped for real that time. Quirrell holds his hand out for the nail.
It was complicated. I have wondered lately if perhaps we did not care about each other as much as we thought, and that perhaps selfishness poisoned any of the good we had. Maybe I'll tell you someday, far in the future, when this is all just an old story, distant in our memories. But for now, it was complicated.
Lem doesn't move. Quirrell looks tired. Not the sort of tired when he'd first come out of the teacher's inner chamber, where he'd managed it by the skin of his teeth, but still came out, ultimately, better for it, whatever it was. This is the sort of tired from an old wound that never healed right, loose ends that were never tied, the sort of tired that only grows. And what can Lem do about that, Lem figures then that it'll still be a long way before Quirrell will ever explain himself, which will be just fine, because Quirrell should have a long life ahead of him to figure it all out. So what does Lem know about any of this? If he were smart, he'd shut up and give that nail back. Lem moves to hand it over and stops nearly instantly. Quirrell looks exhausted. Slowly, Lem takes the nail back, reads the lines again, over and over. Quirrell the scholar, with dates, titles, everything a young student had ever loved enough to write down on paper.
She can't have been that bad,
says Lem. Quirrell is the most politely unimpressed Lem has ever seen from a bug sitting in 3 rolls of bandages in a hot spring.
I don't know people, but I know relics,
says Lem.
These are places you loved, aren't they?
I suppose so,
says Quirrell.
Things I discovered that piqued my interest. The things I studied that made me want to go out there and discover more.
Things you enjoyed for no other reason than that they delighted and fascinated you, without justification or apology,
Lem says.
And I don't know about reasons to live or purposes or knighthood or any of that hogwash, but I know what it means to love a useless thing enough to write it down and carry it with you. This is a blade that outlived its commissioner and its blacksmith, and will outlive you and me, for that matter, and possibly everyone who ever knew us. And these are the things she chose to carve in immortality. In your own words, for your own reasons, your own joy.
Quirrell doesn't reply.
A person who'd make a nail like this, even if it was complicated, you can't say that a selfish person could have made this nail. She gave this to you to keep, and she made it your nail. Not even a nail from her to you, but yours. She must have really cared about you. And I think that's still true.
Quirrell holds his hands out for the nail first, and Lem places the blade back in his palms without complaint. It is only after Quirrell looks down and reads the written words for himself that he looks up and smiles.
Relic Seeker. Who would have thought? I do believe you're right.
Of course I'm right,
says Lem, and breathes a sigh of relief.
Ugh, now get better and eat your jam.
The little bell tolls when the shop door opens one more time. Their pale mask eye holes are already wide open. The dark, instead, moves to wake. The night lifts their head. The light of the lumaflies follows around Quirrell's shape, shining sweetly along the night's pale shell. Quirrell reeks of leaking soul, but none of the dust tastes like the important bits, so those must still be inside Quirrell's shell. The night lets it be. The shadows that are left have polite surprise after Quirrell's own.
An unexpected friendly face,
says Quirrell, as the relic seeker squeezes himself into his own shop after Quirrell.
How good to see you after all this time.
Why are you sitting alone in my shop in the dark?
Says Lem.
What the relic seeker means,
says Quirrell,
is what brings you here, my friend.
It doesn't matter what brings them here. It matters only why. This, of course, is difficult to express to people who don't listen, which is most bugs equipped with speech and verbal language, and Quirrell is regrettably one of those more often than he isn't. It is the times that he isn't that the knight considers treasure well found. Besides, it's no fault or lack of willingness on Quirrell's end, and the knight can be forgiving. The knight will have to gamble with Quirrell's listening comprehension, as they always do, since they've never spoken any language but their own in all the years of their lives. They hold out Quirrell's own cleaning cloth.
Oh,
says Quirrell.
I'd forgotten that, hadn't I?
You were sitting alone in my shop in the dark for a cleaning cloth,
says Lem.
Thank you,
says Quirrell, very pointedly.
That's very kind of you to hold on to it for me.
Carefully, Quirrell sits along the sofa at the knight's side, takes the cloth, and begins to put down his traveling supplies on the relic seeker's cashier desk. The bag, the bandages,
soaked in fresh sole. A small bottle of water.
And now you're putting your trash on my desk, says Lem. Coral puts his nail down, too. Oh, all right, says Lem.
Thank you, Relic Seeker, Coral says, the sound of exhaustion.
The knight hops up on the Relic Seeker's desk and watches as Coral lays down a tin of jam, a pair of spoons, and then the cloth to rest at the knight's feet, pungent with old, cheap metal, the fizz and pop of acid, teardrops on a walkway, the smell of growing older, growing deeper, growing new again.